Racing is dangerous. Every driver knows it, but they push anyway, chasing those last few tenths of a second. Sometimes it goes wrong, horribly wrong. So these are 10 times when F1 drivers stared disaster in the face and lived to tell the tale. Some even came back stronger. This is what survival looks like at 200 miles per hour. Adelaide 1995. What started as a routine qualifying session turned into one of F1's most heart-stopping moments. Mika Hakkinen was flying through Brewery Bend, pushing his McLaren to the edge like he'd done countless times before. Then the unthinkable happened. His left rear tyre gave out at 120 miles per hour. In racing, that's all it takes. One moment, one mechanical failure. The McLaren went airborne. When it hit the barrier, the impact was so violent that Hakkinen's helmet slammed into the steering wheel, fracturing his skull.
That's the issue there, Mika. Oh, look at that. Well, we don't know why. The car came so quickly into sight. Even the camera unable to keep up with it. It flew.
Watch that head. Movement is enormous.
Time stood still in the paddock. 2 trackside doctors got to him in seconds, but found Mika unconscious and fighting for breath since he had swallowed his tongue. Right there on the track, they made the call that would save his life, performing an emergency tracheotomy as teams and spectators watched in horror. But here's the thing about Mika Hakkinen. He wasn't done. Not even close. While most people would have walked away from racing after something like that, he was already thinking about his comeback from his hospital bed. Just a few months later, he was back in the car for the 96 season, almost like nothing had happened. Almost. The crash had changed him though, given him a different kind of edge. He went on to win 2 world championships in 98 and 99. Looking back, Mika's never sugar-coated it. That day in Adelaide could have been the end. Instead, it became the start of his greatest chapter in F1. Some said he came back too soon, but Mika, he just called it unfinished business. Sometimes the smallest things can change everything. During qualifying at the Hungaroring in 2009, Felipe Massa was on a flying lap, pushing his Ferrari to the limit at over 160 miles per hour. Nobody could have predicted what happened next. A spring, weighing almost 2 pounds, had worked loose from Rubens Barrichello's Brawn GP car ahead. In a 1 in a million chance, it struck Massa's helmet just above his left eye. The impact knocked him unconscious instantly. His Ferrari went straight on at turn 4, slammed into the tyre barriers. The paddock froze. This was happening just days after Formula 2 driver Henry Surtees had lost his life in a freak accident. As medical teams rushed to Massa's aid, you could hear a pin drop in the grandstands. Massa was airlifted to a military hospital in Budapest.
He went hurtling into the path of the errant spring and into the tyre wall.
2 surgeries, a fractured skull and a long road ahead, but here's what makes Felipe Massa different. He never doubted he'd be back. While the world debated if he'd ever race again, he was already thinking about his comeback. Within 6 months, he was back in the car for the 2010 season.
Be back on the car, driving, that's my life. So that's the only thing I want to get back in my life for the moment.
The accident changed F1 forever. That tiny spring sparked new conversations about driver safety, eventually contributing to the development of the halo cockpit protection we see today. As for Massa, he went on racing until 2017, proving that sometimes your biggest setback can become part of your legacy. Imola, 1989. 4 laps into the San Marino Grand Prix, Gerhard Berger's Ferrari was screaming down the straight at nearly 180 miles per hour when the unthinkable happened. A front wing failure sent him straight into the Tamburello wall, the same corner that would later claim Ayrton Senna. But for Berger, the impact was just the beginning. When his Ferrari's fuel tank ruptured, the car erupted into a fireball. Berger, knocked unconscious by the 100G impact, was trapped inside what looked like a funeral pyre. The grandstands fell silent. Everyone feared the worst.
And, oh heavens above, this is dreadful. There are no words that can add to this appalling picture.
But what happened next would go down in F1 history. The track's fire marshals, later nicknamed the Lions, reached the burning Ferrari in just 20 seconds. Going against standard procedure that said to wait for race control's orders, they knew every second counted. In less than 40 seconds, they'd extinguished the flames that could have claimed Berger's life. Berger escaped with broken ribs and some burns to his hands, but the crash changed F1 forever. Ferrari discovered their wing design couldn't handle their driver's aggressive curb riding style. More importantly, it led to completely new fuel tank regulations with the introduction of the Kevlar-based FT5 safety bladder that F1 still uses today. Years later, Berger would track down each marshal who saved him that day, thanking them personally away from the cameras. Sometimes the biggest heroes in F1 aren't the ones behind the wheel. Bahrain 2020. First lap just after turn 3. What happened next would become known as the miracle in the desert. Romain Grosjean's Haas clipped Danny Kvyat's Alpha Tauri and speared into the barrier at 192 km per hour. That's 119 miles per hour. The impact was so violent, measuring 67 G, that his car split clean in half. The front half, with Grosjean still strapped inside, punched through the metal barrier. Then came the fireball. The fuel tank had ruptured, engulfing the wreckage in flames. For 28 seconds, which felt like an eternity to everyone watching, Grosjean was somewhere in that inferno.
The car, and it's literally...
Whoa!
Yeah.
It's just... the car...
It's gone through the barrier, you see. The car's gone through the barrier.
But somehow he kept his cool. Working his way around the barrier that had trapped him, he managed to pull himself out of the burning wreckage. The medical car crew, Alan van der Merwe and Dr. Ian Roberts, reached him in seconds, helping him over the barrier as flames still raged behind them. Grosjean walked away with just second-degree burns on his hands. Later, from his hospital bed, he said something that summed it all up. The halo is the greatest thing we've brought to Formula One, and without it, I wouldn't be able to speak to you today.
It was a miracle. It was absolutely a miracle.
In just 28 seconds, decades of safety innovations, the halo, the survival cell, the fire-resistant suits all came together to save a life. While this was Grosjean's last F1 race, he'd go on to race an IndyCar, proving that sometimes the most important victory is simply walking away. The Nürburgring, August 1976. They called it the Green Hell for a reason. At 14 miles long with 160 corners winding through the Eifel Mountains, it was the most dangerous circuit in Formula One. Niki Lauda knew it. He tried to organise a boycott, worried about safety, but lost by 1 vote. The race went ahead. Second lap in, Lauda's Ferrari snapped right just before the Bergwerk corner. At racing speed, the car slapped into an embankment, bounced back onto the track and erupted into flames. The impact was so violent it had torn off his helmet. Trapped in the burning wreckage, Lauda was fighting for his life. But 4 drivers, Brett Lunger, Harold Ertel, Guy Edwards and Arturo Mazzario, stopped and ran toward the inferno. Mazzario, knowing how Ferrari's complicated seatbelt worked, reached into the flames to free Lauda. Lunger pulled him out by his shoulders, dragging him to safety as fuel leaked toward them. Lauda suffered severe burns to his face and lungs from inhaling toxic fumes. The doctors gave him the last rites, but just 6 weeks later, still bandaged and bleeding, he was back in his Ferrari at Monza. He'd missed only 2 races. While he narrowly lost that year's championship to James Hunt, his comeback became the stuff of legend. The crash changed F1 forever. It was the last race held on the old Nürburgring, marking the end of an era when circuits could be beautiful but deadly. Sometimes the most important victories in racing aren't about finishing first, they're about surviving to race another day. Imola, Friday qualifying. Rubens Barrichello was flying high after scoring his first F1 podium at the previous race. His Jordan felt good underneath him, maybe too good. Coming into the Variante Bassa chicane, he was carrying 15 km per hour more speed than his previous lap. In racing, that's all it takes to change everything. The Jordan caught the steep curve like a ramp. Suddenly, Barrichello was airborne, shoulder height to the barriers. Pure instinct made him raise both hands to cover his face as his car slammed into the top of the tyre wall at 140 miles per hour. The impact was so violent it knocked him unconscious before the car even hit the ground, nose first, and rolled. Professor Sid Watkins and the medical team found Barrichello struggling to breathe from blood in his mouth. They quickly cleared his airway, and as the young Brazilian was rushed to the medical centre, his condition started improving. The first person he saw when he regained consciousness, Ayrton Senna, who had rushed to check on his countryman.
You've seen Rubens.
He's alright. He's alright. He's shocked, of course, but he's alright.
Barrichello escaped with just a broken nose and a sprained arm. His Jordan had absorbed the massive impact, showing how far F1 safety had come.
One of the more violent accidents I think I've ever seen. I was watching that in England and absolutely horrified.
He was knocked unconscious and says he has no memory of the incident.
I just remember saying, oops,
was something that I recall. I think, you know, as I crashed, my tape rewind. It was something that I don't go to the crash. I don't remember crashing.
But this was just the beginning of F1's darkest weekend. Within 48 hours, both Roden Ratzenberger and Senna would lose their lives on the same track. For Barrichello, it was a brutal reminder of how quickly everything can change in Formula 1. Jerez, Friday qualifying. One moment, Martin Donnelly was pushing his Lotus through the fastest corner of the circuit. The next, everything went terribly wrong. A suspension component had worked loose, and when it finally broke, it did so at the worst possible moment, just as Donnelly turned in at 140 miles per hour. The impact was so violent it split his Lotus in two. The sight that greeted trackside workers was chilling. Donnelly lying motionless on the track, still strapped to his seat which had torn free from the chassis. Professor Sid Watkins, F1's chief medical officer, reached him in 11.5 minutes. Donnelly wasn't breathing. He'd swallowed his tongue in the impact. Watkins got him breathing again right there on the track. But the battle was just beginning. At the hospital in Seville, doctors wanted to amputate his shattered left leg due to blood loss. Watkins used his own belt as a tourniquet and refused to leave his patient's side, arguing in 2 languages to save the leg. Over the next weeks, Donnelly's organs shut down one by one, just as Watkins had predicted. 3 times his heart stopped, 3 times they brought him back.
The accident, it took everything from me. It took my income, my mental health and well-being, my mobility to ever walk right again. It took my dream of becoming an F1 world champion.
Donnelly survived, though his F1 career was over. His left leg remained 1.5 inches shorter than his right, and he never regained full mobility. But the crash led to vital safety improvements that would save others. Years later, he'd say that maybe someone upstairs was trying to tell him something. They brought him back 3 times after all. Sometimes walking away is the biggest victory of all. Suzuka, Friday qualifying. The 1987 championship was coming down to the wire between Williams teammates Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet. With Piquet ahead on point, Mansell was pushing his Williams to the absolute limit, determined to beat his rival's qualifying time. Through the SS they called the Snake, Mansell was carrying more speed than ever before. Then it happened. The Williams snapped away from him. The impact with the barrier was massive. As medical teams rushed to the scene, the championship battle that had defined the season was suddenly over. Mansell's injuries, a severe concussion and bruising to his spine, forced him to miss not just this race, but also the season finale in Australia.
He lost his Williams Honda. The tremendous impact did the damage. Mansell was in agony in the cockpit. He released the wheel but couldn't get out.
The crash handed the title to Piquet, who couldn't resist twisting the knife afterward, declaring that intelligence had won over stupidity. It was a bitter end to what could have been Mansell's year. But Il Leone would return stronger than ever, finally claiming his world championship in 1992. The crash highlighted how even qualifying sessions could end championship dreams. One moment of oversteer, 1 split-second miscalculation at racing speed was all it took. In Formula 1, the line between glory and disaster was often thinner than a tyre's contact patch with the track. Monaco, first practice session. Karl Wendlinger was riding high after finishing 4th at Imola. At just 25, the Austrian seemed destined to follow his former Mercedes sports car teammate Michael Schumacher to F1 stardom. Then came the braking zone for the harbour chicane. His Sauber snapped sideways at 110 miles per hour, slamming into the barriers. The impact was so severe it knocked Wendlinger unconscious immediately. Doctors placed him in an artificial coma for 19 days to help him recover. His last memory, going to bed the night before. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in a hospital in Innsbruck, wondering why his knee hurt.
A very big accident in first qualifying session this morning.
Wendlinger fought his way back, determined to race again, but something had changed. His first drive after recovery was in his road car. Traffic backed up behind him as he crept along unknowingly in slow motion. In F1 testing, he was seconds off the pace. Even worse, severe headaches began plaguing him during longer runs. He got one more chance with Sauber in 1995, but after 4 races, the truth was undeniable. The head injuries had taken something crucial away. As Wendlinger himself would later admit, the doctors told me I could lead a normal life, but the head injuries were probably too severe to withstand the stresses of Formula 1. Sometimes the hardest part isn't surviving the crash, it's accepting that you can't go back to who you were before it. Montreal, lap 26. The safety car had just pulled in when Robert Kubica's BMW Sauber clipped Jarno Trulli's Toyota heading into the hairpin. What happened next will leave the motorsport world holding its breath. The car hit a grass verge and launched. At over 180 miles per hour, Kubica's BMW slammed into a concrete wall with sickening force. The impact was so violent it tore the car to pieces. Wheels, nose cone and side pods scattered across the track as what remained barrel rolled before coming to the rest on its side. Through the wreckage, Kubica's feet were visible where the front of the car had been torn away. His head wasn't moving.
That's a big accident for Kubica, and a horrible accident going on there. He's moving his hands, and that was at maximum velocity. I've never seen a car crash like that.
In the media centre, journalists sat in stunned silence, none daring to voice what they feared. But then came the news they desperately hoped for. He's alive! The safety features had done their job. The car had disintegrated exactly as designed, dissipating the enormous forces away from the survival cell. Incredibly, Kubica suffered only a sprained ankle and mild concussion. Even more remarkably, he missed just one race before returning to the cockpit. A year later, at the very same track, he would score his first and only F1 win. It was a testament not just to the safety of modern F1 cars, but to the unshakable spirit of racing drivers. As Kubica himself would later prove, you can't keep them away from what they love. 10 crashes, 10 survival stories. Each one could have ended differently, if not for quick-thinking doctors, brave marshals, or safety innovations born from previous tragedies. Every time a driver walks away from a wreck today, they owe something to these moments, when F1 learned its hardest lessons. The sport is faster than ever now, but it's also safer. And these are the stories that made that possible.